Welcome back. Penny Wong has signalled a major policy shift for Australia, suggesting the country is open to recognising a Palestinian state. The Foreign Minister made the comments while discussing a two-state solution in a speech last night, saying it's the only way to undermine Hamas and foster long-lasting peace in the region. Joining me now is the co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Ryvchin. Alex, thanks so much for your time. First of all, do you see where Penny Wong might be coming from here?
I think she's acting and speaking here with the best of intentions. I'm certain that Senator Wong wants to see an end of the conflict, an end to this war, an end to Hamas, and a period of sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. We all want that. But the question is, when is the right time to talk about this? And who is to blame for the absence of peace? And when you have right now a situation where Israel is literally fighting for its life, for its survival, where 134 of its citizens are still held captive by a band of rapists and torturers, when its soldiers are still fighting in tunnels every day to take out Hamas, when they are facing extraordinary threats from Iran and its proxies in Lebanon and Syria, this is not the time to be lecturing one of our key allies. This is a time to be standing in solidarity and showing understanding. And the very notion that we should right now be talking about a two-state solution, about statehood for the Palestinians, just 6 months after one of the most unspeakable atrocities of modern times, it really rewards that sort of violence. And it sends a horrible signal to rogue actors and terrorist forces throughout the world that acts of ultra-violence could lead to political transformation. And that makes the world a more dangerous place.
Is the intention still to have a two-state solution, though?
I think it has to be the intention. I think it's the only way. It's been the only path since 1937 when it was first spoken about, since 1947 when the UN General Assembly proposed partition. That has always been the formula for a peaceful resolution to this conflict so that both sides can live in peace and dignity. But the problem is that one side has steadfastly refused to acknowledge the very legitimacy, the very rights to exist of the other. The Israelis, for their part, have found peace whenever there's been a partner willing to accept them. With Egypt, with Jordan, the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians in 1993, the Abraham Accords. But the Palestinians still have not been able to utter the words that they recognize Israel as a Jewish state. That is the greatest impediment to a two-state solution. And that, frankly, is where the foreign minister's efforts should be concentrated.
Is it Palestinians, though, or Hamas? Because I know Hamas has rejected every single peace deal put before them and not recognised and still do not recognise Israel's right to exist. But is that true of Palestinians as well?
Well, in the case of Hamas, Hamas has to be destroyed and dismantled. There's no other way. They've shown themselves to be wholly unfit to be a neighbour to any civilised state. And so there can be no future with Hamas, and the the foreign minister is in agreement on that point. Yeah. But in terms of the more moderate Palestinian Authority, they themselves have their own problems with glorifying violence, with corruption, with their own intransigence, and also still fundamentally denying the right of Israel to exist. They have made certain remarks over the years where they recognise Israel, but never as a Jewish state. They've never said that they want a peaceful solution to the conflict side by side with a Jewish state rather than in place of it.
Are you talking about the Palestinian Authority here?
I am talking about the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, when judged alongside Hamas, looks like a very reasonable actor and fairly moderate. And they are more reasonable in certain regards, but also they still have not been able to utter the language of recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. And when they do, when they come to terms with the fact that Israel is both legitimate and permanent, then I believe we can see an era of peace develop. But until that point, we're going to see perpetual conflict, which is where we are now.
Yes, it's where we are now. And we learned yesterday that Benjamin Netanyahu has set a date for the invasion of Rafah. This is at a time that we've seen tens of thousands of Jews protest against his leadership. How should we interpret those protests?
Well, before this war, there was a great deal of discontent in Israeli society about the leadership of the Prime Minister. There's no doubt about that. The country was divided, ripped apart really by this question of judicial reform, about the encroachment on the powers of the judiciary. and Israelis fiercely defend their liberties and the independence of their institutions. And the war and the atrocities of October 7 certainly unified the nation, but the longer it's gone on, the more we see those divisions re-emerge in terms of how the war is being handled, in terms of whether the Prime Minister is doing enough to liberate the hostages and arrive at a deal with Hamas through Qatar and Egypt. Israel's a vibrant democracy, and people will have views and they will express them forcefully. That's the nature of the state. But ultimately, the country is unified on one question, and that is the need to defeat Hamas, the need to defeat its final battalions in Rafah, and the need to do whatever necessary to get those hostages home.
When we talk about defeating Hamas, I think there are 4 battalions, from best information I have, still left in that enclave of Rafah. But since really the beginning of the war, since the October 7 attacks, the Hamas centralised command, they fled to Doha. So when you talk about wiping out Hamas, can that really be done when really the operatives, the puppets of Iran, aren't in Gaza?
Well, that's true, and Qatar has a great deal to answer for. The fact that for years now they've given safe haven, shelter in great luxury and comfort to the leadership of Hamas, who have personal wealth in excess of $14 billion, which should really, in all reasonableness, be seized and redirected to the Palestinians in Gaza for reconstruction and aid, but instead it's kept solely in the hands of its leaders. But ultimately, it's one thing to deal with the leadership in Qatar, the ringleaders, but at the same time you have to deal with the forces on the ground, the ones who have it in their power to unleash the sorts of atrocities we saw on October 7. So both aspects of Hamas need to be dealt with. Its leadership, its ties to Iran as well, but also its fighters on the ground. And Israel will not know peace and security. Its residents of southern Israel who have had their lives decimated won't be able to return until the fighting forces of Hamas and their sinister leaders like Sinwar, who are now underground, are defeated. That needs to happen.
Sinwar is on the ground in Gaza? Do we think?
Underground. So it's believed that he's in Rafah with the rest of the leadership in tunnels surrounded by the hostages, which creates for an extremely difficult situation.
If Sinwar was captured or killed, do you think that would be the end point of this war?
I think there's a good chance that it would be, but it's difficult to predict what will happen after such a situation, whether that would lead to a deal to exchange the hostages, whether that would lead to mass surrender of the remaining Hamas forces. This is a wide-ranging war and it's a complex one, and it requires the destruction of the fighting capacity of Hamas. It requires the destruction of the leadership. And certainly, if the leadership is taken down, the remaining fighting forces, which by all accounts are in disarray already and are surrendering at a pace, dropping their weapons, running and hiding among civilians, they will cease to exist as a coherent fighting force. So certainly the strategy needs to be both to take down the leaders and to take down the fighters, and that's what Israel's been pursuing since the beginning.
And just finally, Alex, Mark Binskin has been appointed by the Australian government to look into the actions of the IDF. It's unclear whether the IDF will cooperate with Mark Binskin. Do you think the IDF should?
I think they've been placed in a very unfortunate position by Australia. I wholly understand the outrage and the distress caused by the strike on the aid workers and the absolute need for accountability and an investigation. Israel, within a day or so of that incident, from the President to the Prime Minister down, accepted responsibility, wholeheartedly apologised, mounted an investigation which led to the dismissal of 2 senior officers, which Israel said is merely the first step in this process. They are determined themselves to understand how this terrible mistake happened and to ensure that it doesn't happen again. But this notion of a foreign country, of an allied state, bringing in an envoy to investigate, it's really without precedent. And I think that it puts our fighting forces here in Australia in a compromising position down the track. Friendly fire incidents are inevitable in any form of urban conflict, and I would not want to see us in a position where, due to a tragic error of the sort that we saw here, that another country is sending their people to investigate Australians. I think there's got to be a degree of trust and good faith between allies.
Okay, Alex, thank you. We'll speak to you soon.